But my old mentor said that he got away with the big lie because people actually want to believe the big lie. And so when he said things like, I borrowed in 1975 a small amount of money from my dad and I converted it into billions of dollars, it sounds good. And so people are like okay with it. When the story comes out that you accurately report and you've got the tax returns that he lost billions of dollars and he inherited $400 million from his dad, and if he just put it in the S&P 500, he would have done way better, that he's literally squandered the treasure that his father gave him, and he blocked his family members, some of his family members, from getting it. It's not a good story. Okay, a big delight for me. Joining us now is Russell Buettner and Suzanne Craig. They are both world famous investigative reporters for the New York Times. The title of the book is Lucky Loser. What great alliteration. I just hope no one ever calls me the lucky loser. But the title of this book is Lucky Loser: How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success. And boy, are we living with the yoke of all that now, guys. So I want to go to the first question, and sort of these are for both of you, and we can switch back and forth. But since 2016, you've both been focused on the personal finances of Mr. Trump. Susan, specifically, I've seen some of your interviews. I think you've got some of this information from the Trump family, articulating how much money he was given, what he did to divide out and conquer his other relatives to keep a lot of that money, and then what he did with it. But let's go to both of you with this central question. Why did you take this on? So let's start with you, Suzanne, and then I'll ask Russ the same question. Why did you get involved with this?
Well, it started because an editor just asked me if I could look into Donald Trump and his money, and that was back in 2016. I'd been covering Governor Cuomo in Albany. I just arrived at City Hall. I was going to be the bureau chief for the New York Times, covering then Mayor Bill de Blasio. I was super excited about it. I'd been in the seat 3 weeks, and I get a call from the Metro editor, and he says, hey, can you just come out for a few weeks? Donald Trump is, just announced that he's running for president. Nobody really thought he was going to be in very long, and I was told, you'll be back at City Hall in a few months. I never went back. And we started just writing on his finances back then. Very little was known about his finances. There's been this, discussion in New York and the tabloids that he was this billionaire, and all the noise that went around with that. But we really didn't know much about how much he was worth, even in some cases what he owned. It was a privately held company, and it was sort of just shrouded in mystery and mainly his myth-making about it, which was false. So Russ and I started writing on it. We each did, kind of separate stories prior to the election. And then 6 weeks before the election, I went to check my mailbox one Friday afternoon, and I found in my mailbox, it was incredible, a manila envelope addressed to me. It had 3 pages of what looked like Donald Trump's 1995 tax returns. And when I went to the line about how much we assumed he had losses, it looked like he had $1 billion in accumulated losses in 1995. We couldn't believe it. We worked round the clock to try and confirm that. We ended up getting it confirmed from an on-the-record source, accountant that had signed the document. And from there, we kept working, just trying to uncover more information. And we started looking at how much Donald Trump had inherited from his father, Fred Trump. And that story, we just started digging into property records and calling people. And that story that ran in 2018, we discovered Donald Trump, he long claimed that he had inherited almost nothing from his father. In fact, he inherited hundreds of millions of dollars from his father, and it was enhanced through tax fraud. That was the story. You mentioned some Trump family members helped us with this. Mary Trump had given some really important documents that helped us get to that story. And then we just kept digging, and we got it later on. Another source gave us 20 plus years of Donald Trump's personal and corporate tax returns that led to a series of stories in 2020. And there were other stories along the way. So it was really a organic journalism effort that just kind of kept going, and now has ended up with this book.
So this is the heart of Mr. Trump. If there's an Achilles heel for Mr. Trump, it's this book. And so Russ, let me go to that. I mean, he believes his political power comes from the Celebrity Apprentice, as you guys pointed out in the New York Times Sunday article this weekend, and that it comes from his wealth. He is a genius, multi-billionaire. He's the only person that the Forbes 400 people say tries to boost his record. A lot of people are trying to get themselves off that list. He's trying to get himself higher up on it. And so this strikes right at the heart of him. And so, Russ, why give yourself this agita? Why, you seem like a nice guy and probably have a nice family and everything. Why would you want to be antagonized by him? Because I'm sure he's antagonizing.
Yeah, the world is full of unpleasant people, and we don't pick our subjects usually based on how fun they are. But this one is particularly unique because, as you know, he pops onto the political scene in 2016 with nothing much behind him but years as a television celebrity and this business record that he says shows he's an incredible genius, that he's a multi-billionaire, and that he's promising he can now do the same thing for the country that he had done for his businesses. But this was a very small, privately held family company. To try to do the usual vetting that we and the public would do of a candidate for president was very difficult because those records are not there. Even compared to, say, Mitt Romney, you could look back at the funds he'd been involved with and tell something about that. And most people running for office are government officials who have a long public track record.
Mitt divulged his tax returns, though.
He
right?
did.
I mean,
The first thing. And Trump went out of his way to hide all that. Right. So that to like investigative reporters is just like a magnet. Come to me, right? And everything that we found out just sort of upended another element of his myth of who he was. And when we get to the end of it, we've done sort of 3 large stories over a 5-year period. But there was so much more to tell in just connecting all that and trying to figure out where it was that he became the person that he was, what it was that American culture sort of enabled him to tell these lies about what he was doing and still be credible. There were changes in the media ecosystem in those years that were a big role. And so it just felt like as a long narrative exploring sort of an American century in the Trump family, it really had weight and helped us get to understand where we had gotten to.
So, I mean, the title of your book is awesome. I mean, I love the alliteration and I applaud you guys for the title. But the title I was thinking of when I closed your book was Unchecked Bully. And throughout his life, he's an unchecked bully, and this book is providing the checks on a lot of things that have gone on. And I want to go right to the adolescent Trump. You guys have new interviews. You've went to his former classmates and friends, as well as some details about his high school years at New York Military Academy. The lore is that his father found him recalcitrant and found him to be very difficult, so he sent him to Military Academy for grooming. But he was... excuse me, I'll say that again. He sent him to Military Academy for grooming, but he was unruly at the academy and was shirking some of his duties, yet continued to rise in the ranks. So tell us what you learned in these new interviews about this young man, Donald Trump.
Russ, do you want to start that one?
I mean, sure. It's an interesting thing. There's a split between, as you would see throughout his life, between sort of the way he portrayed himself and then the realities of the situation. So he gets there and it's a military hierarchy, but it's not really a military operation. Of course, these are young kids and their main thing is wearing uniforms, marching, playing sports, making their beds in a certain way, cleaning the bathrooms. And there's this hierarchy of authority that develops. There's some adults that set the overall temperature of the place, but then most of that enforcement of those things falls to senior cadets, to high school kids who are managing the people below them. And Donald Trump right away seems to recognize that he wants to be in those upper ranks of people. And he tries to do that, but he has a problem. He doesn't actually manage the people that he's associated with. In fact, one of his captains beats up a young cadet and they decide he's just been too inattentive to managing the sort of power structure there. So they move him off. A lot of the cadets there thought he would be pushed out of leadership altogether, but they put him in a supply role. And he was sort of at that level, but not really part of the overall kind of hierarchy of authority. And then this like weird thing happens as they're taking the pictures for the yearbook in his senior year. He wants that authority still. He's still craving it, or that sort of the honor of that. He wants the credibility of having done really well there. So he has this friend, Michael Scadron, who has all these medals from various things he's accomplished during his years there. And Donald asks to borrow his dress uniform so he can sit in the yearbook photo with all of those medals. And that sort of gets to the split between what he wanted to be, how he presented himself, and then the reality of the situation.
But it also speaks to his general mendacity, right? So he's able to, when you play golf with him, it's known as the Donald Trump foot wedge, where the foot comes out and kicks the ball everywhere. And I have buddies of mine play golf with him, and he races up, he takes their ball off the fairway, throws it in the rough, kicks his ball 50, 60 yards down the fairway. And so he's been doing that his whole life. That's why I say he's an unchecked bully. He's unchecked. He's allowed to do this. There's something about the American culture that is allowing for this. Before I read your book, I saw Trump as Logan Roy, and I saw him as the patriarch in secession. When I finished your book, I actually now see him as Kendall Roy. I didn't realize that distinction, but Logan Roy is Fred Trump.
Yeah.
Okay. And he's actually Kendall Roy, and there's this weird relationship. There's a combination of loyalty but also manipulation in that relationship based on your reporting and based on the way you describe it. And so tell us about Fred Trump and the power that he had over Donald Trump.
Well, I hadn't thought about it that way, but it's a really interesting story because Donald Trump looms so large in our life, but when you actually go back and you look at it, it was Fred Trump who really was the power.
Well, you taught me that, Suzanne. I didn't get that on my own.
I just hadn't thought about that Logan because there's a lot of succession in this book.
I saw him as the patriarch, but he's really not. He's the oldest son dies of alcoholism. He becomes the heir apparent to the oldest son, and he has all of this. But he's been hit hard by the dad. And so there's a lot of that Kendall Roy insecurity in Donald Trump.
There's so much of it. And when you see what happened, there was another brother, Fred Sr., Mary Trump's father.
Yep.
And it's just a tragic story. Initially, not surprisingly, he was the eldest son. There was a time when Fred saw him as the heir apparent. And we talked to people who went to school with Freddie, the young son, the eldest son. And it sounded like he planned to go into the family business at one point, but he also had other interests, and he just became inadequate to Fred, the father, and it never worked. He quickly fell away. He ended up dying of alcoholism when he was in his early 40s, and Fred Trump needed an heir. He wasn't going to pick his daughters. They were just, that was not a path for them. They even went to different schools than the boys. So Fred Trump put his chips on Donald. And it's really fascinating when you think about that, because whatever you think about Fred Trump, he was a good businessman, and he didn't believe in debt. He didn't believe in giving, personal obligations to banks. He believed that cash was king. There were so many things that he, just the disciplines of business that he had that Donald Trump broke. Famously the debt Donald Trump would take on, just all of it. And no matter what, we never saw a moment where Fred Trump, once he had made the decision that Donald Trump was his man to take over the company, that he wavered in that decision. So it is fascinating when we've thought a lot about it. It's quite surprising when we talk to people who knew sort of real estate moguls at that time, and they knew the sons. There's a lot of instances in New York where the son, would be coming up the ranks to take over the father's company, and those men for the most part seem to be really hard on their sons. And one of the people we talked to in the book said he'd run into Fred Trump, and Fred Trump would just be like, "Isn't my Donnie great?" And Donald was basically a black hole for Fred Trump's money, but he just never seemed to question it.
So there's manipulation though there too, right? I mean, he's manipulating his son. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sometimes I think, Anthony, it's the other way around, that Donald was manipulating his father.
When I read it, I read it as like Well, maybe I got it
I
wrong.
think a bit of both, though. Maybe actually, now that I think
So
about it,
I had the. Do you agree with my Kendall Roy analogy or no? I mean, I got that out of your book actually. So that was one comment. But the second comment, I felt like the father wanted Trump to be a certain way, and he was going to push and shove him, and the money was incentivization to get him to do things a certain way. Do I have that wrong? Or maybe I have that
I mean,
wrong.
it's hard to say, like,
Right.
I don't know if we can get into the relationship that much. I'm sure that was a component of it as well. I think one thing that struck us as interesting and surprised us was the degree to which, as Sue said, once Freddie, the older son, is out of the picture and Donald Trump emerges, Donald Trump is in many ways the polar opposite of Fred Trump. He brags about doing projects that he never does. Fred Trump never did that. He doesn't pay attention to the bottom line, and so he runs huge deficits. Fred Trump never did that in his entire career. And he doesn't pay his bills. Fred Trump never did not pay a bill. And he was incredibly braggadocious. But Fred Trump embraced those things and he would defend them. And by the time around 1984, when Trump Tower is starting to open up, there's this weird scene where they're having the capping ceremony at the top of the tower. And Fred is there. He's now 80 years old. But suddenly he sounds like Donald Trump. Somebody asks him how sales are going, and he said, "Stupendous, fabulous, best ever in the history of New York City." He had never spoken like that. We had watched interviews with him. He was very dry and precise when he talked about things, even when he was in trouble and irritated by the line of questioning. But all of a sudden, he's like a chain of superlatives, just like his son. And even as Donald Trump lied about his father's accomplishment to elevate his own, saying my father was small time, my father built little projects in Brooklyn and Queens, not acknowledging those projects would be worth $1 billion in the course of Fred Trump's lifetime. Fred Trump didn't object to that. He said, yes, he surpassed me in every way possible. So it is a really weird and dynamic relationship. And I'm sure what you're saying was a major component of it as well.
So I asked one of my, I got my career started at Goldman Sachs after I left law school. And I asked one of my mentors, who's now 80, he would insist on being nameless because he'll choke me if I put his name out there. But I asked him about this because he knew Trump and he knew Fred. Okay. And remember, I started in the real estate department at Goldman. And so the first time I met Donald Trump, I was an associate at Goldman Sachs. And this is obviously, Trump would have never remembered that meeting because I was probably in my late 20s at the time. And obviously he was famous. I wasn't. But my old mentor said that he got away with the big lie because people actually want to believe the big lie. And so when he said things like, I borrowed in 1975 a small amount of money from my dad and I converted it into billions of dollars, it sounds good. And so people are like, okay with it. When the story comes out that you accurately report and you've got the tax returns that he lost billions of dollars and he inherited $400 million from his dad, and if you just put it in the S&P 500, he would have done way better, that he's literally squandered the treasure that his father gave him. And he blocked his family members, some of his family members, from getting it. It's not a good story,
no,
Susan. So Suzanne. So what ends up happening is people don't believe it. They like hearing the other story. There are people at his MAGA rallies that would read your book and say fake news,
right?
Not believable. Donald Trump is a mega genius, a startup billionaire. What do you say about that? What's your reaction to what I'm saying? Do you believe anything I'm saying, or do you think?
I think people love a hardscrabble story, and I think Donald Trump actually was born into wealth, and he was probably upset that he was robbed of the opportunity to tell a hardscrabble story, so he's made one up.
Right.
I mean, it really is something, and I think people do want to believe it. And then I also think we have to remember the time that Donald Trump sort of came of age in New York. It was a celebrity. He was known more as a celebrity, as a businessman. I worked at the Wall Street Journal. I covered Goldman Sachs for years. Those were publicly traded companies that had to report in every quarter. Donald Trump reported into Donald Trump. We could never really get inside it, but his company also wasn't consequential in a way that big publicly traded companies like Goldman were. When I covered Goldman, it was a full-time job at the Wall Street Journal, just covering Goldman Sachs. And so he sort of was on this celebrity kind of specter in New York. And so I just think there were some reporters who did incredible work on him. Neil Barsky is one at the Wall Street Journal when Donald Trump had the casinos and there was publicly traded companies involved, and he did puncture some of the lies. But I think that it still amazes me. One of the things about the book that he was able to rise for 20 some years with, first of all, appropriating his father's wealth as his own, and then just lying about his wealth. And it was just repeated over and over and over by the New York Times, by 60 Minutes. It almost defied belief when you actually just started looking at some of the basic facts back then that we could find, but it just kept going.
Well, your colleague Maggie Haberman in the book The Con Man, she writes about the headline, "The Best Sex Ever." It was a total manifestation of his mind, and he was able to get it into the front page of the New York Post. Was never said by his second wife. Okay, let me go to this. I'm going to ask you this, Russ. Obsessed. He's absolutely obsessed and possessed about status. And rich people in my lifetime, and again, maybe you guys have had a different experience, but super rich people are not obsessed about that. They just aren't. And so, striving rich people are, but not really rich people. Like when Trump says, "I'm really, really rich," first thing I think of is Shakespeare. Doubt does protest too much, meaning he's not really, really rich. So why, Russ? Why the obsession? What do you think it is?
It's an excellent question. I mean, I think it's part of the definition you see in narcissism. I'm not a psychologist, but you have to believe that you're superior to everybody else in the world, right? And that seems to have been the main mission of his life, is to portray himself as superior. And that's a benchmark that he used. I think in our book, Fred Trump is a great sort of juxtaposition for that again, because he lived a modest life. He built a house for his family in the early 1950s, and they lived the rest of his life in that house, and never took extravagant vacations. Went to Florida, never took a cruise, bought his wife a mink coat once a year, every once in a while, bought her a Rolls Royce every couple of years. But that was it. Donald Trump immediately becomes obsessed with symbols of status and wealth as a symbol of his excellence. And I think that's part of what the book has to say about how we got here and American culture's sort of role in his rise, is that the qualities that we imbue in people who show signs of wealth. Right? He was right, it turns out, to want it, because people did assume he was excellent. People did assume he must be really good at whatever he says he's good at, because look, he's got a jet, right? That's all you need. And that has sustained itself. And you combine that, America's sort of acceptance of excellence when there's signs of money, and not wanting to challenge those people, not feeling comfortable to say, I'm as smart as them, to question what they're doing, with somebody who, as you said, is built on mendacity, who has no shame about lying right to your face, even when he knows that it's not true at that very second, right?
No, you could have the object in your hand. He'll tell you this object is green.
Right.
And you're staring at the object, but he's telling you it's green. And then you start to, okay, I'm being gaslit, but he's like, okay, he does I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was going to say, you're making such a good point too about, that people who are actually rich don't want the attention. And I remember in 2016, I started doing some stories on his planes. One of them was the big 757, and kind of how crappy it is. I got on this because somebody who I covered on Wall Street, one of the CEOs, who's quite wealthy, I was talking to him one day on the phone, and Trump was running, and he said, "You should really look at that plane because it's in awful condition." He goes, "I wouldn't step on it." Like people in New York sort of saw through it. He was buying the accoutrements of wealth and often didn't keep them up. And I think people who actually had money, they don't want the attention, and they saw through him.
Well, I mean, that plane is loud. The plane is a gas guzzler, but it's the size of the plane
and the advertising.
He's trying to impress the hoi polloi with that plane, and he's already made the decision begrudgingly that the ultra rich will never really accept him. The posers will. But the super rich, whether they're in Palm Beach, up here in New York, or you pick them, are disgusted by him. They won't let him into their country clubs. They won't let him into their private New York clubs. And all of this stuff is a chip on his shoulder, which he's now society wants to take out on the rest of us by being our president. I want to ask you about, and I'll ask Suzanne this. What was it in the reporting on this book that you uncovered that surprised or shocked you the most?
I think two things. As a reporter, I day in and day out, and we spent a couple years on it, which is how many people hadn't been called about Trump and just how much fresh information we were able to surface in a book about somebody who's arguably the best known person in the world. And that was really exciting for me as a reporter. But when I step back and I think about just, it's still, we've talked about it, it's still, I still can't believe that in the 1970s and the 1980s, just how he was immediately as a 20-something-year-old able to say he was worth $200 or $300 million. And that went on for a couple decades, and there was very few people who questioned it. And we were just amazed at how many talk shows he went on, and Larry King, and we talked about 60 Minutes, that how very few people questioned that. I remember one of my favorite anecdotes, he was on this Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous show. Robin Leach was the host, and they loved him. A lot of rich people wouldn't go on that show because they didn't want the attention, but Donald Trump was tailor-made for that. He had all these accoutrements of wealth. He had the airplane, the yacht. He would take Robin Leach to the casinos. And one trip, he went on to the casinos, and the casinos weren't doing well, and they're filming something fabulous to do with Donald Trump. And one of the producers gets called over by a couple of the people that work there, and they're like, hey, by the way, he's not paying his contractors. And this guy was kind of shocked by this, and he talked to Robin Leach, and they decided to cut him off the show. And the producer said to me, we'd milked that cow, and we're moving on. So he even got cut off Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous during this, but that myth continued to grow even after that.
All right, so we're going to go at the end of my podcast. I always ask our authors, we pick out 5 words from the book. But before I go there, this is not who you want to win the presidency. It's a yes or no question. Is Donald Trump going to return to the presidency? Russ?
Oh, my God. Crystal ball, yes or no?
Yeah.
No.
Suzanne?
No.
Okay, so that's 3 no's. It's interesting. And that's just not me talking my book. That's my observation. I think people are exhausted. And I think, I don't know. Do you think Herbert Hoover said that he hated Rudy Valley on Twitter in 1929? Do you think he did at 28? I don't know.
That is excellent. That's great.
I don't know. I mean, it probably didn't. I don't think, right. It probably didn't. Okay. So we got 5 words. Okay. And I'm going to read you these words, and then you're each going to give me a 1 or 2 word or a sentence reaction. Okay, we'll start with you, Russ. I say the words lucky loser. You think what?
I think a guy who benefits from things he doesn't control, and the things he does control don't turn out well.
Okay. Suzanne, anything you want to add?
That was great. He's born to elect, found it through Mark Burnett, the television producer, and pretty much everything he invested that money in, he lost it.
There you go. Okay, so you're going to go to Suzanne first. Now, Trump Organization. I say the 2 words Trump Organization. You think what?
Small group of advisors with a fair bit of turnover over the years.
Okay. And Russ?
The wheel of a bicycle. Few spokes all going to one person in the middle.
Yeah, interesting. And also, you guys do point out in the book that they're found guilty of criminal tax fraud for avoiding payroll taxes. So there was a lot of stuff going on there even before he runs for president, which is even more glaring that he had the gall to run despite all of this stuff in his baggage. He's the first person that can run with tremendous baggage, wives, affairs, porn stars, and he keeps running. I say the words Fred Trump, Russ. You think what?
Serious businessman.
Okay. Suzanne, anything to add there?
A serious real estate builder and a tough dad.
Yeah, see, that's what I think tough dad. I think ultimately you, me, and Russ are being punished because Fred was a tough dad. Unfortunately, it's not just the 3 of us. It's the global society is being punished. Okay. I say the words Donald Trump. Suzanne, what do you think?
A lot of things. Showman and a confidence man.
Okay. All right. Russ?
Yeah, I was going to say magic act.
Yeah. See, it's interesting. I see a very sad figure there. You know, when I hear the words Donald Trump, I see a very vacuous hole that is not going to be. There's just no level of healing that's going to ever take place there. There's a sadness there that I see. Anyway, that's my opinion.
I think that's a really important part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's why he's still striving the way he is. The word Trump, which is ubiquitous. So Suzanne, I say the word Trump. What do you think of?
A diminished brand.
Diminished brand. Yeah, see, that's interesting. So that's exactly what I thought. So let me flip it over to Russ.
I think it's pure vanity. And I don't mean just his putting of his name on it. I mean that he just wanted to, everything that he felt he was attracted to, he wanted to put his name on, whether it was a golf course one day or an airline. It was like, it became sort of the hobby of the day.
So, you know, if you guys didn't do this work, I mean, if he hadn't run for president in 2015-16, you know, I had worked with him on the Romney campaign. We raised some money for Mitt. I saw a brand in ascendancy. I know that sounds probably crazy today, but he was, you know, the show was doing well. He was producing some real estate and some golf course product that people liked and they were buying. And, you know, he had covered over whatever the losses were. He'd done a good job of that, but he opened up a seam of exposure by running for president. And I think that brand is greatly diminished. And I would say permanently. I would say that's a permanent
brand now. We talk to brand people about that,
Yep.
and some of them aren't even tracking it anymore.
Yeah.
It's really a political brand now,
Yeah.
and it's a lightning rod. Yeah.
Yeah.
You look at that year you're talking about, that period of time, 2011 was his heyday of The Apprentice and licensing. He made $50 million from those two things for almost no real significant work. He put it into the Chicago Tower, which he declared totally worthless. He put it into the old post office, which lost money and he had to sell it. He put it into Scottish golf courses and British golf courses that are all sucking money from everything else. It was a period, like you said, it was the height of his powers. And again, a second fortune that sort of went away.
Yeah, it's interesting. So his angle of attack has not been the right one. So before I let you guys go, what are we investigating next? Or we're not ready to say.
I think I'm ready to investigate a beach in the Caribbean somewhere.
Okay, all right, so we're investigating.
I'll find another beach in the Caribbean.
Okay, there you go. All right, so you guys are going to take a little bit of a break. The title of the book, which is it's just a fantastic title, Lucky Loser, How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success. Russ Buettner, Suzanne Craig, thank you so much for joining me today on Open Book. I look forward to your next work, whichever it will be, post-Beach. But really, really great job on this book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony.
It's in the basement of the White House. For the longest time, it was the most nondescript room in the world. As I said, it was set up right after the Bay of Pigs by John F. Kennedy because he was pissed off after the Bay of Pigs. He felt misled by the CIA. He felt misled by the generals, and he wanted to have his own information stream coming in to the government. It's kind of amazing that there had never been a Situation Room in the White House before that. Roosevelt had the map room during World War II. Of course, Lincoln famously went down to the telegraph office during the Civil War, but there had never been a permanent Situation Room in the White House until John F. Kennedy set it up in 1961.
Joining us now on Open Book is George Stephanopoulos. He's the host of ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. He's also the co-anchor of Good Morning America, but so many other things, George. The first time I met you, and you're not going to remember this because you were famous at the time, I was not, a gentleman by the name of Rahm Emanuel introduced me to you in the Roosevelt Room. And this was maybe the first or second month of the Clinton administration. And so I'll tell you what happened to me. My roommate, I don't know if you would remember Rick Lerner or Jen Scully, but my roommate worked for a guy named Kenneth Brody, who became the export.
Yeah, he was one of President Clinton's earliest supporters in the campaign.
Exactly. And so he worked for Ken Brody, who unfortunately is now deceased, but he took me on tour in the White House. He was working for Rahm Emanuel at the time. You walked in. looking exactly the way you do now, except with a little bit of gray hair. And you introduced yourself. And of course, that was the first time I met you. And then, unfortunately for me, after I got fired, you were my first interview.
I remember that.
But you were very nice to me, which I'll always be grateful for. And you are the author of this very, very terrific, insightful insider's view of things. The title of the book is The Situation Room: The Inside Story of Presidents in Crisis. You know, when I'm reading the book, I'm thinking of people like McGeorge Bundy. You know, I'm thinking of Bobby Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis and the 13 Days. I'm thinking of
the Situation Room back in '61. That's when it was first set up, right after the Bay of Pigs.
Yep. I'm thinking of Graham Allison, who wrote Essence of Decision. Okay, so you're in the genre of this is why the American people, among many other reasons, have the American presidency. A crisis comes, the president of those three branches of government, the president is the one that is perhaps the most flexible, that can move the most quickly. And of course, he or she, it'll eventually be a she, is the commander in chief and has to make Johnny on the spot decisions in the Situation Room. So I've been in the Situation Room. You've been in the Situation Room. Before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about the Situation Room and what should the American people know about it that, of course, isn't classified.
You've been there. You know, it's in the basement of the White House. For the longest time, it was the most nondescript room in the world. You know, it was, as I said, it was set up right after the Bay of Pigs by John F. Kennedy because he was pissed off after the Bay of Pigs. He felt misled by the CIA. He felt misled by the generals, and he wanted to have his own information stream coming into the government. It's kind of amazing that there had never been a Situation Room in the White House before that. I mean, Roosevelt had the map room during World War II. Of course, Lincoln famously went down to the telegraph office during the Civil War, but there had never been a permanent Situation Room in the White House until John F. Kennedy set it up in 1961. You know, there's a fascinating side story on that. The guy who first mentioned the idea of a Situation Room to Kennedy was a man named Godfrey McHugh, who was just a larger-than-life character, French-speaking, French-accented American Air Force general who had the most amazing life. He had lunch with Churchill and Roosevelt at the White House when he was basically a teenager. He dated Jackie Kennedy before he dated John F. Kennedy, and he became Kennedy's closest military aide. He's the one that sent him the paper saying, we need a Situation Room to deal with the Cold War. Kennedy did not act on it at first, but he did act on it after the Bay of Pigs. They built it in like 2 weeks. Ironically, and you know, you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis up at the start. Ironically, once it was built, Kennedy didn't go there all that much. He actually ran the Cuban Missile Crisis mostly from the cabinet room. He took the information from the Situation Room, but he didn't go there that much because for most of its history, up until really this year, the Situation Room was just this tiny windowless conference room that looked like a Poconos conference room in the basement of the White House. And Kennedy even at one point said it was a pig pen. So he didn't go in there that much, but he did draw on the information that was being gleaned by all the professionals who serve in that room.
Well, I mean, it is a lasting legacy of that administration, right? Because we're talking 60 plus years later.
Absolutely.
And I think it's become more important. And of course, President Biden, it was scheduled. So no matter who won the presidency in 2020, it was scheduled for a refurbishment, and it got a refurbishment, a multi-million-dollar refurbishment. Have you been in it since it's been refurbished?
It's incredible. You know, when I was interviewing people for this book, I interviewed over 100 people. My first question in the interview, just to break the ice, was always, do you remember your first time in the Situation Room? I actually didn't. I couldn't remember pinpoint my first exact day. And a lot of people didn't either, in part because it was so unremarkable. But my impression when I walked in last August, which was just as the renovation was being done, is, wow, it finally looks like it's supposed to look in the movies. It finally looks like it's coming out of 24 or Dr. Strangelove. It is super high tech right now. It's actually now a series of conference rooms, including the famous Kennedy conference rooms, a watch center where the professionals who keep an eye on all the information streams coming into the government is manned 24/7. It's kind of got stadium style seating. the director sits behind them, behind a glass wall that can go dark whenever he or she wants privacy. There's screens on every wall. They can actually have, and you'll appreciate this from your time in the White House, they can actually now have G8 meetings of foreign leaders. And they did it after the Ukraine war, live in the Situation Room. They can bring in 8 to 10 foreign leaders and have a virtual meeting at this point in a way they never could before. But now when somebody walks into the room, they can also wipe the screens immediately of all classified information. It is super high tech.
As recently as last week, he had a couple of the G8 people in there talking, and you could see them on the screens. I'm going to read you a quote from Jack Kennedy. I want you to respond to it. And then I want to talk a little bit about the current state of affairs in the Situation Room. This is a direct quote from Jack Kennedy. And he says, and I quote, "These brass hats have one great advantage in their favor," he said. If we do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them that they were wrong. And he was specifically talking about Curtis LeMay. Do you remember Curtis LeMay?
Of course.
So tell us, Jack Kennedy had a distrust of the American military.
He certainly, the reasons he set up the Situation Room, he felt that they were often putting him in a corner, and Bobby Kennedy reinforced that view. He didn't want to be pushed into that corner at all. You know, it's interesting. You say align it to current events. Interestingly, the role that President Biden played in the Obama White House was to push back on President Obama's behalf against those brass hats, against the generals who he felt were pushing for a longer commitment and a higher commitment to the war in Afghanistan than was wise. And he would often run point for the president in pushing back against the generals. But the whole idea of the Situation Room was to give the president independent control over the various information and intelligence streams coming into the entire government, so he wouldn't be beholden to his cabinet secretaries, to the military. And, you know, in that sense, and you made the point, the Situation Room has only gotten more important with every passing year, and it's contributed to the centralization of power inside the White House, and probably the expansion of the power of the presidency over the last 60 years.
Okay, well, the book is fantastic. It goes into a lot of stories. I want to delve into them with you. But before I delve into them with you, tell us firsthand experience. Clinton administration, something obviously long ago, hopefully declassified. Tell us a Situation Room story from your time in the White House.
I'll tell you one funny one, one serious. The most serious one was, of course, was actually after Oklahoma City. You know, when the courthouse was bombed in Oklahoma City, and we were at that point concerned in the immediate hours after the bombing that, you know, perhaps this was part of a series of bombings that might be taking place across the country. So that was one of the most high tension moments that I experienced in the Situation Room. And in fact, I was finally able to find a picture. It's hard to get pictures from inside the Situation Room. I was finally able to find a picture from that day that we were able to put on the back cover of the book, showing.
Yeah, no, I have the picture right here, George. See, there you are in there
on that day.
Sandy
Berger as well. My hair was a little bit longer at that point.
Hey, look, you know what, man? At our age, okay, the fact that we're keeping our hair is a great blessing, okay? It's a mitzvah, Stephanopoulos. It's a mitzvah from God. Exactly right. And both of us are still, because, you know, we got a lot of bald friends, you and me, Stephanopoulos, a lot of bald friends.
We sure do. But let me just give the lighthearted story as well. Yeah. This was actually right on the edge of the Situation Room, which was right next to the White House mess. And that is where I met Robin Williams, who had just come back from looking at the Situation Room. I was down there getting a cup of coffee, and it was so interesting because, you know, he's a comic genius, but, you know, we all have our insecurities. He was incredibly socially anxious. So instead of having a conversation, he just did bits there for 3 minutes right there at the White House mess on the threshold of the Situation Room. And it just always stuck in my mind, watching this genius, so uncomfortable that really all he could ever do was perform.
Well, listen, an amazing guy, and that's a great biography, by the way, on him.
Yeah.
Shortly after his death, it was published. But just for our viewers and listeners that are young, what George is referring to, the White House mess, also located in the basement of the West Wing of the White House, is staffed by the U.S. Navy, and so they have chefs in there, and you can go in there if you work for the president. You have an account. It's usually tied to your personal credit card. And you go in there, you can have a meal, you get a takeout, you can get a hamburger, or you can sit down in the mess and have lunch. And although I was in the White House for a short period of time, I did that almost every day because it gave me the opportunity to see other staff members down
It
there.
hangs out, right?
And I was able to have some conversations and push along some projects that we were working on. I want to go to President Nixon for a second. Like Jack Kennedy, wasn't a lover of the Situation Room. He hardly, according to the book, he hardly set foot in the
Yeah.
Situation Room. And Henry Kissinger said that Nixon was convinced that President Johnson had suffered from Situation Room syndrome. Tell us what that is, and tell us whether or not you agree with
Johnson
Dr.
probably
Kissinger.
used the Situation Room more than any other president. He was there all the time. He moved his seat from the Oval Office, his favorite chair from the Oval Office down there. He even had Lady Bird serve breakfast to the staff every once in a while. And he was calling them all hours of the day, night, almost always about Vietnam. But, one of the things you saw there is that Johnson, who was a master of domestic politics and his, a vacuum cleaner for information. He had 70 phones at his ranch in Texas. He had TVs and phones in every room of the White House. He always wanted to be in contact, and he wanted every piece of information coming out of Vietnam. But, one of the things that I learned from researching that experience is that, information isn't always insight. The information that he was getting couldn't tell him how to win the war because it was a war that was unwinnable, and he had sensed that, but he just felt trapped by it all. Nixon was determined, and Kissinger were determined not to get caught in that same trap. And what Kissinger meant by the Situation Room syndrome was this idea that you could control the world from that windowless room in the White House, which you can't, but you can do an awful lot, make a lot of consequential decisions in there. There was a different reason, though, an additional reason why Nixon did not go to the Situation Room. He didn't trust the Situation Room. He didn't trust the foreign policy professionals. Remember, he and Kissinger famously tapped the phones of many of their national security staff. And in that way, I think he shared something with the president you served for a short period of time, Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't trust the Situation Room either. He considered it the home of the deep state. He hardly ever used it as well.
Well, I mean, it's a funny story about Kissinger and Donald Trump. And so now Trump has won the election. It's December of 2016, and I had the opportunity to escort Dr. Kissinger into President-elect Trump's office, 26th floor Trump Tower. And Dr. Kissinger, he must have spent 15 minutes with Trump, which is a long time for Donald Trump, at least, particularly at that time.
One sentence.
And watch me, George. Ready? And so Trump looks over at me. He's like, "What is he saying?" And I said, "Well, I got to get a little closer to him." So his accent was such that Donald Trump stopped listening after like 3 minutes. But what he was saying, and I want you to react to it. Okay, what Dr. Kissinger was saying is that we needed to pay more attention to Russia, and we needed to be more wary of Russia, but to treat them like a respectful adversary. He said that the wound that Obama inflicted, calling Putin a regional power, which was blasted all over the press, had hurt President Putin's standing in Russia, and he was seeking retribution for that. Anyway, it was a memorable moment for me because I hadn't spent much time in my life with Dr. Kissinger. That was probably the second or third time I had met him. But he moved the White House, and you write about it in the book. Dr. Kissinger, in the Situation Room, moved the military alert level to DEFCON 3.
Incredible moment in America.
Tell us a little bit about that. Tell us why.
This is October 73. It's the Yom Kippur War, the first Yom Kippur War in Israel. Israel has been attacked. And it's the height of the Cold War as well. It's also the height of Watergate. In that same month, Vice President Agnew had resigned under indictment. The tapes had been released. The articles of impeachment had been drawn up. Nixon is under siege, and he is basically holed up in his private office in the old executive office building, drinking scotch late into the night, and listening to Broadway tunes on his record player while this crisis is playing out across the Middle East, a crisis which threatens to go nuclear. And the concern of Henry Kissinger at the time is that Russia was going to get involved on behalf of the Egyptians and Israel's other adversaries. And so on his own, without the involvement of the president at all, there's no evidence at all the president was involved in the decision-making that night. Henry Kissinger raised the alert level of our nuclear forces at DEFCON 3, which had only been done once before during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Extraordinary that a national security advisor would do that on his own. What I love about it, we learn about this from a memo that was written by someone in the room, one of his military aides, Admiral Moorer, who called it a piss swisher of a meeting. I had never heard that word before.
You're right about it.
I saw that, and then one of the other things I learned as I was researching this book, not only did Henry Kissinger make this move, which by the way did work, by putting the forces on DEFCON 3, it did sort of back the Russians off a little bit. But what I also learned, and it came out many years later from the Soviet archives, is that not only was Nixon incapacitated at that time, drunk, depressed, concerned he was losing his presidency. He was losing his presidency. Brezhnev was kind of in the same state. Brezhnev was in his dacha outside of Moscow on sleeping pills and vodka. And it was, the superpowers were kind of acting on automatic pilot with the staffers at the helm while both presidents were incapacitated.
When I read it, I was alarmed by it, but then I was also weirdly comforted by it.
Yeah, what you're saying.
Because, the world's moving, and it's not, what did Charles de Gaulle say? There's a graveyard's filled with men who once thought they were indispensable. So we did a little research on you. You're born on February the 10th. I won't give the year of your birth because you and I, we look so good, Stephanopoulos, that we should be lying about our age at this point in our lives. But you were born on February 10th, which makes you an Aquarius.
I am.
Now, our four greatest presidents. You're not that much older than me, believe it or not. Okay, but I don't know. I just turned 60, so I'm getting up there, my friend. But in any event, you're an Aquarius. There are four presidents that are Aquarians of significance. I'm gonna tell you who they are: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, who's born 2 days after you on February 12th, Ronald Reagan on February 6th, and of course there's FDR, born on January 30th, 1882.
Oh, wow.
And so that's the horoscope moment for Open Book. Now let's go to the psychic moment. We're going to go to the psychic moment of Open Book.
Story in the book.
Okay, and this is a story that surprised you the most, and it obviously surprised me. Jimmy Carter used psychics during the Iran hostage crisis. So tell us what you uncovered there.
Incredible story, which I had never heard before. We were doing our research, and I came across a single line in Jimmy Carter's presidential diary. It was from May 1980, and it said, had a meeting in the Situation Room on parapsychology, longitude, latitude, etc. One line, but it obviously piqued my interest because it had parapsychology and Situation Room in the same sentence, and I'm writing a book about the Situation Room. This meeting had never been written before. My team and I looked through all of the published materials, couldn't find anything written about this meeting. But working through the Carter library, we were able to figure out who might still be alive, who would know something about that meeting, because one of the other people in the meeting was Zbigniew Brzezinski. Of course, he's passed away. But I was able to find a man named Jake Stewart, who was President Carter's naval aide. And we found out that he might have been in that meeting. So I emailed him, I called him. He was very reluctant to speak. finally, after about 3 emails and several conversations, he finally agreed to do the Zoom. And we set up the Zoom, we start the interview, and I said, tell me, I said, this May 1980 meeting, tell me about this meeting. And he just sat back, smiled, and laughed and said, you found out about that, huh? And proceeded to tell me the most incredible story. This is May 1980. This is 2 weeks after the failed rescue mission of the Iran hostages, which basically crippled the Carter presidency. Carter is desperate. He's
probably finished it. Yep.
Yeah, he's running against Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is doing well in the polls. Inflation is high. The economy is stuck in the mud. He needs to do something, and his rescue mission has failed. So he's desperate times call for desperate measures, right? He's willing to consider anything. It turns out that Jake Stewart was the expert in the White House on something I didn't know much about. There is a whole group of psychics being run by the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency at the time. They called them remote viewers. And these were people who would sit in dark rooms and theoretically use ESP to get to the bottom of international crises. It was called Operation Girl Flame. Some people swear that it had some reasonable success, would be right 30 to 40% of the time that they were able to call that they were able to find out about a plane crash in Africa where several were killed. According to one report, one of the remote viewers had a vision of helicopters crashing in the desert on the same day that the helicopters did indeed crash in the desert. So anyway, Jake Stewart goes to the Situation Room. It's just him, the president, speaking of Brzezinski, and interestingly, Rosalind Carter, the first lady. You don't hear about first ladies in the Situation Room at all, but that was because she was kind of a big believer in psychics and ESP. She had become a friend of, remember Uri Geller?
Yeah, sure, of course. He could bend the spoons. Yeah, of course.
She had a several hours long meeting with him. She believed in it. So they call Jake Stewart in. He gives them an entire briefing on the work of government psychics in the CIA and the intelligence community. Carter doesn't say a word. And at the end of this briefing, he takes out his notepad and simply writes one word on it and pushes it across the table to Stewart. You can guess what the word was.
Bullshit.
Hostages.
No. Hostages. Okay, there you go. He was
hostages. Can you help?
That's it.
And
that's it. Yeah.
That was one thing to help, figure out where the hostages might be. Stewart took it on. He maintains that that through the work of the psychics, they were able to locate one of the hostages, Richard McQueen, who was suffering from multiple sclerosis, and were able to figure out where he was, and that he was actually taken out before later. That summer, of course, the rest of the hostages were not released until Ronald Reagan was inaugurated several months later.
What an incredible story, and I'm so glad that you were able to regale it here. We're coming to the last few minutes of this podcast, and so I want to just ask you one quick question about the 6th of January, 2021. Which happens to be my birthday, George. So for the first 57 years of my life, I was enjoying that birthday. Now it's Trump Insurrection Day.
January 6th has become kind of a swear word.
Yeah, exactly. So it happens to be my birthday. I think there's a lot of irony in that, right? So it's also Eric Trump's birthday, by the way. Mike Stigler, tell us what he said, and then we'll go to the famous 5 words, and we'll have you blocked out of the podcast.
Michael Stigler, amazing guy. It had been on his bucket list to work in the White House, intelligence analyst. He was finally assigned to the White House in the first, with about 18 months to go in the Trump administration. So he lived through all the turmoil, through COVID, through the Black Lives Matter protests, through the carrying of the Bible to Lafayette Square. And then he was in the Situation Room on January 6th. And, think about what it must have been like to be an intelligence analyst in the Situation Room that day. The Situation Room has been the nerve center of the White House for 60 years. They've dealt with the assassination of one president, John F. Kennedy, the attempted assassination of another, Ronald Reagan. They were on their posts on 9/11 when the country was under attack. It was the heart of the White House where the most consequential national security decisions were made, but never before had these professionals who served in that room had to be in the middle of the crisis center of the White House to handle a crisis, an insurrection inspired by the president himself. What Mike Stiegler had to do on that day, he was in direct contact with the Secret Service, who were with Vice President Pence. One of the things he told me is, what still haunts him is the idea that we still don't know, he said, how close we came to losing the vice president at the very moment that Donald Trump is sitting up there in his study, sipping Diet Cokes and sending out a tweet attacking the vice president as a coward. He also described to me how they had to implement what we call the continuity of government operations. You're probably familiar with this from your time in the White House. This was something established by Eisenhower to establish how procedures to ensure the survival of the government if we were under nuclear attack. They actually started to implement the continuity of government procedures, figuring out whether they would have to evacuate cabinet members to remote locations, figuring out who would move up the chain of command if others were taken out. This had only been done once before in modern times, and that was on 9/11. It was done on January 6th because of this insurrection inspired by the president. It shook Mike Stiegler. It shook him to the core.
Yeah, listen, you've written an amazing book, the great stories, and of course, Vice President Pence, unlike Kamala Harris, Vice President Pence is not endorsing the former president. So it's an interesting situation. Okay, so we have 5 famous words on this podcast, Mr. Stephanopoulos. I read out the word or the phrase, and then I ask our authors to react.
Okay.
And so you can give me a sentence, a word, something that comes into mind. I say Clinton, and you think of what?
Complicated.
Okay. I say the year 2024. You think?
Consequential.
Yeah. Okay. Well said. Very consequential. I'll add the very. Okay. How's that? Okay. I'll say the 3 words: the Oval Office.
Center of power. Sublime light.
Yeah. A lot smaller than I thought, by the way. My first time in it, I was like, it's a lot small. Am I wrong?
Well, the whole West Wing is smaller than you can imagine. But boy, there's nothing like being in that Oval Office.
No, there's nothing like being in that Oval Office. My first day in that office, Trump looked at me and said, "You and I both like action. You can't get much more action than this." That was literally an exact quote. Okay. So, crisis.
The crises are the moments that define our lives.
Okay. So crossroads, right? An inflection point, right? Okay. And then, of course, the last word and the title of your book, I say the Situation Room, the inside story of presidents in crisis. I say the Situation Room. You say what?
Buy it.
All right. That's a good one. Okay. Well, I bought it. And let me tell you something. This is a great book. It's going to be a New York Times bestseller. There will be professors around the country that will be signing this book. It's a seminal work, and it's a work that's going to go up there with the Allisons and the McGeorge Bundys and even Jack Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy. Thank you for joining us
Thank you, Anthony.
on Open Book, and I hope to see you soon.
Me too. Take care.